This is the statue of John Wesley. It stands in Wesley House here in London. John Wesley in the 18th century covered this nation and brought revival to England, and it deeply influenced the culture of England. This is not just a historical curiosity for Australians. While those who first came to Australia were convicts, cast-offs from England, those who followed in the next 100 years, many free settlers were influenced by the revivals here in England. We may not have seen large-scale revivals in Australia like brought by Wesley here in England, but that doesn't mean that the revivals here didn't influence our nation. It's another reason that faith runs deep in Australia. So, John Wesley, what created his passion?
Well, he believed that he had experienced that his own life had needed revival, that he had been an almost Christian because he had believed, but he had never experienced God. He had never taken a decision to turn his life over to God and to be, to receive the grace that God freely offered him. And once he had experienced that, he then thought the whole Church of England needs revival, and so he toured the country, convincing people that they needed not just to go to church, not just to pray and read the Bible and be good people, but that they needed a total change in their life that comes from simply accepting the offer of forgiveness that God gives.
When did John Wesley start to preach across the UK?
He started when he was 35 in 1738.
John Wesley is one of your heroes. Why is John Wesley a hero for you?
He's a hero for me because reading about his life, he combined Reformed theology with really seriously living it. Wesley preached to the lower classes. The Anglican Church, or the Church of England, the established church, jokingly called the Tory party at prayer, had become frankly corrupt and hollow. I mean, there were still great individuals, but as an institution, it had really lost the confidence of the lower classes, the vast bulk of English society. And Wesley took it to the people. Open air preaching.
The kind of thing that you would be likely to hear in a sermon if you went to your average Anglican church in the 18th century was that you should obey the 10 Commandments, be a good person, don't lie, don't steal, and you should say your prayers and read the Bible, go to church. That's the gospel. And what Wesley said is, all that's true, you should do all that stuff, but that is not going to save your soul. That is not going to get you into a relationship with God. The people who do that are almost Christians, but what makes you a Christian is being born again. You have to allow God to turn your life around, and it's a free gift from God that you need to accept. And all you do is accept it, and then you're a Christian, and you are saved. And this was a very controversial message at the time because it was about people taking their spiritual lives into their own hands, working people, changing their lives around. And they would get together in huge numbers to hear Wesley talk about this.
What sort of changes did that make in the community?
Let me read you Wesley's own words. Wesley, at the beginning of his ministry, particularly focused on the mining community in Bristol, particularly the notorious area of Kingswood. And after a year, after 6 months working there, this is how he described it. The scene is already changed. Kingswood does not now, as a year ago, resound with cursing and blasphemy. It is no more filled with drunkenness and uncleanness and the idle diversions that naturally lead thereto. It's no longer full of wars and fightings, of clamour and bitterness, of wrath and envyings. Hardly is their voice heard in the streets or indeed in their own wood, unless when they're at their usual evening diversion, singing praise unto God, their Saviour. So Wesley's talking about a complete transformation of the whole feel of a local area.
Wow.
Many of the early clergymen who came to New South Wales and the other colonies in Australia were Methodists. You know, they had or low church Anglicans who'd been heavily influenced by Wesley.
First Methodist Richard Carboso. He was a product of the evangelical revival, obviously, the Wesleyan, greatly impacted by Wesley. His father had experienced revival in Cornwall, and so when Richard Carboso came to Hobart, he was the one who was responsible for the first revival in Australia in the early 1820s. Preached the gospel to 200 convicts, and they began to witness genuine revival there.
As you discovered in some of your research, there are a number of different revivals, and one of them, which is a kind of an odd one, was the Light of the World painting that did a tour of Australia, which is odd. So what's the painting, and what was the response?
Yes, I think that is a sign of revival. I think that in the first decade of the 20th century, from about 1902 through to about 1906, 7, 8, there was a lot of revival movements in Australia. It almost came close to a sort of awakening. Holman Hunt painted the famous painting, Light of the World. He was a pre-Raphaelite artist. And you know the famous painting of Jesus knocking at the door of the heart. And he's carrying a lantern, being the light of the world. And it's a very beautiful painting. Anyway, he took it on a tour of the British Commonwealth, British Empire, as it was then. And when he took it to Adelaide, 18,000 people turned up to see it. When he took it to Melbourne, it was somewhere between 200 and 250,000 people who came to visit it. When he came to Sydney, it was 316,000.
Wow.
When the population of Sydney was 500,000.
Yeah.
Apparently they went through the turnstiles at the art gallery 3 every second in order to see this painting. And when they came to it, some of them bowed down before it. They knelt before it. Some wept. Mothers instructed their children about what this was all about. Told them to be good boys and girls. It was quite a thing. It just shows that Australians have had this spiritual need.
Yeah. The people from history and the people around the world that have influenced me or stuck in my mind most over the years are just people who had a go. You know, like they weren't the smartest, they weren't the greatest. Just a passionate heart and belief that I can make a difference. And those sorts of people are absolutely remarkable. When I was working in this large church in Sydney, one of the guys that had grown up in the church accepted a call to a church in Western New South Wales. And it was a tiny church. And I remember at the time thinking, oh gosh, why would you go there, you know? And here I am in a large suburban multi-staff church thinking that's the future. And I had this, you know, ungodly attitude really, which was, oh, what a terrible choice that would be. It was actually around that period of time that I remember thinking, well, if Darryl Robinson thought like that, my dad's life wouldn't have been changed.
So a lot of the copper mines and the coal mines of South Australia and New South Wales case of coal mines, were occupied by Welshmen. Some of them couldn't even speak English, and Cornishmen, and they were strong Wesleyans, so they established strong Wesleyan communities. If you went to a place like Burra in South Australia, or Moonta, you'd have about 11 different Methodist churches of different types. You'd have one Anglican church, one Catholic church. You know.
And these weren't educated people in the sense that they were miners, everyday people, influenced by the power of the gospel.
Yes, certainly there were some educated people that went and heard Wesley, but the vast majority of his hearers were ordinary working people whose lives were often hard and brutal, who, by following Wesley and getting together to encourage each other to live the life he was talking about, were able to create communities that changed individual lives and changed whole local communities as well.
The Mount Kembla Revival. Tell us about that.
The Mount Kembla Revival was an amazing event. It took place early in 1902. Mount Kembla is just one of many coal mines which dot the Illawarra coastline, really. And there was revival in each of those coal mining villages, one after another. Hundreds were added to the churches in those villages. You know, 167 Mount Kembla, 292 at Helensburgh, and so on, all the way up the coast. It was quite remarkable. It was the work of an Australian Wesleyan revivalist called O'Donnell, and it's reported about in the local press, in the secular press, the Illawarra Mercury, at the time, and that's why I think it's so remarkable. The press in those days, it's just wonderful, all the details they give. There are things like reports on why O'Donnell thought this was a genuine revival. He was asked for evidence of this, and he said things like the largest output that they've ever had in a single day has resulted at Mount Kembla after the revival. There is no longer a swear word heard in the mine, and the repayment of debts and all these sort of things. So they went on and on about the impact of the revival. But on the swearing bit, what amazed me was the report that the pit ponies stopped working because they could no longer understand the commands of the miners, because they now spoke with pure speech.
When you first got married and life for you and your wife, what was that like? What were you like as a person?
I'm often ashamed of the life that I caused my wife in the first, say, 10 or several years. And because I was an alcoholic and I used to drink anything that made me drunk, doesn't matter what it was, methylated spirits or whatever. And it wasn't until in 1962 that I accepted Christ into my life that I changed, radically changed. And so all those years before that, it were pretty unpleasant for my wife and family.
So in that, what happened in 1962 to make you change?
1962, there was a crusade at La Perouse, and I went along to listen to the music mainly because there was a lot of guitar music, and I came under conviction that I had to do something about my life, and it was an incredible conviction because I remember breaking in the middle of winter. I broke out in a cold sweat, and its perspiration was dropping off the bottom of my chin. That's how much conviction I was under. And I had to get out of that place as quick as I could. And so I ran for it. And next day at work, I was working in the building industry. As strange as it was, I was by myself all day in different rooms, and I was thinking about this experience. And what was it? What happened to me? So I went back again the night after, and I knew what it was. It was a conviction that I should do something about my life. And I committed my life to Christ there in 1962 and radically changed.
So how did it change? You were an alcoholic? Did
Alcoholic.
that immediately change?
Overnight, I couldn't stand to even hear a person swear, and swearing was a part of our main language for young people, and I couldn't stand to hear people swear. I lost my desire to drink or be around grog. I hated this stuff, and I had this love for the Lord Jesus, and I thought, now this is not me. This is something that's come out of my depths, and I was able to live a life, and I've been like that ever since that day.
Most people might know the name Billy Graham, but who was Billy Graham and what was the 1959 crusade?
Billy Graham was a Southern Baptist preacher. He was born at the end of World War I, and then after World War II, he emerged as one of the leading evangelists around the world. He'd speak to packed stadiums all over the place. He'd have tea with the Queen, and he'd be friends with presidents. A really influential figure. Probably spoke to more people in person than any other person in history. And he was invited to Australia by all of the Protestant churches for a crusade in 1959. He was here for 3 months. He spoke hundreds of times to thousands of people and packed out stadiums around the country. He, in fact, holds the record for attendance at the MCG. I mean, the cauldron of Australian religiosity has the record held by Billy Graham, and 130,000 people made a decision for Christ. It made a profound impact on the fabric of Australian life.
So Dad's working on the farm in Tambar Springs, and there's a new minister in the tiny, tiny little church, St Mark's, Tambar Springs. Darrell Robinson's wife had been influenced by Billy Graham at the 1959 Billy Graham Crusade. So he wanted to run a mission in this tiny little church. So he invites 2 preachers to turn up, John Turner and John Chapman. They then just invite people from the community. So my dad in the farm gets invited to turn up, and he listens to the message, and then he thinks, I should talk to this John Turner guy. And John Turner kind of said to him, can I pray for you? And he wasn't even sure what prayer was, but he thought, yeah, sure. In that prayer, something changed. He actually wrote in the memoir the next day, I went to work and it was different, and I walked home to our house, which is this tiny little house on this property, Breffni, and my 2 sons, which would have been Peter and I, ran up to me, and we walked home to the house together, and it felt different. Like there's a really interesting that there was no sort of theological debate, there was no sort of deep intellectual concept, there was no existential angst that caused this to happen. It was hearing, responding, prayer, and then everything changed.
Billy said afterwards that he'd never come across spiritual hunger like it in Australia. I think he felt especially called to come to Australia. He'd received lots of requests to go all over the place, but he felt that this was one that the Holy Spirit wanted him to obey, to go to Australia and take these crusades. 143,000, I think, packed into the MCG, the largest crowd that's ever occupied that sacred turf. They even allowed them to walk on the turf, to sit on the turf.
In 1959, Billy Graham comes to Australia. Famous gatherings around the country. In Melbourne, in the MCG, you were there.
I was there. Well, you see, in 1959, I was a national serviceman. And I and a friend of mine from Victoria applied for a weekend off, got permission, and we went down to the crusade. Right? And my friend had been training in the choir before he'd got called up into national service. And he said, well, all my mates are in the choir, all my friends are in the choir, I can get us into the choir. So we got around the back way into the back entrance and we got put in the choir. Except we stuck out, you know, like a sore thumb, because here we are in our military uniform, which you're not allowed to take off. And there we sat in the choir and went through the, you know, the whole thing. But there was Billy Graham preaching and preaching, you know, and when he finished, he did the Billy Graham thing, come down, you know, to about, you know, the call down to take Christ into your life, you know, come down from the back stalls, come down from there. And he turns around to the choir and says, come down from the choir. And then he says, yes, doesn't matter, you guys in the military uniform, come down.
So you got a personal invitation?
That's right. So I had a personal invitation to come down, and you know, from Billy Graham himself. So therefore, I've never lost it.
When they came to Sydney, they exceeded that because they used the showground and the SCG, both of them, the 156,000. A quarter of Australian population went to hear Billy.
Yeah.
And 1.24% of the population accepted his invitation to come to Christ.
Is there a way of assessing the impact of the 1959 Crusades?
I think there is a personal impact, and you can tell thousands of stories of people who, you know, had their whole life transformed and started new lineages of faith in Australia. There's stories of churches that were rejuvenated both by the energy of those who were involved in the crusade, who started to take their faith seriously again, were trained, and those who joined those churches. But I think more broadly, there's a sense in which it affirmed the centrality of Christian faith to what it meant to be Australian, at least for the next kind of 10, 15 years.
Oh, I think it had a huge influence, largely through those people who came to Christ at the crusade. And many of them went on to make a significant contribution to the Australian church. Leaders of many denominations. Archbishop Peter Jensen, for example, Archbishop of Sydney, was converted at the Billy Graham Crusade. So, you know, it had a huge and lasting influence, and there's still this kind of effect that goes on through the church today.
Your dad and mum ended up at the Billy Graham Crusade.
Dad and Mum became Christians. I think Dad was always inclined, because he was always at a Baptist church or but he wasn't a Christian. I know that. And it wasn't until he committed his life to Christ, and several years before, and he was at the Billy Graham Crusade where my sister came to Christ. Dad was already a Christian, and my sister came to the Lord. And Dad was working as a minister by this time with the Mission Publications at La Perouse, and where he spent 18 years as a minister. So Dad was well versed in the scriptures.
Do you see it as important for you to pass that faith on to the next generation and the next generation?
I think it's a must. I think it's for all Christians. I think it's something that we can't be out of doing, because God has brought you into being for that, for the very purpose of being a witness for Him.
Daryl Robinson's son has written emails to my brother and myself. And one of the emails he sent to me talked about how much Daryl Robinson was encouraged by my dad constantly. You probably have no idea. My dad always felt that Tambar Springs was definitely the mission field when he arrived in '62. The vicarage had not been occupied for more than 10 years and was covered in cobwebs. There was no water at all. I remember it well. I have vivid memories of that John Turner, John Chapman mission. Both Johns stayed in our house, which was cramped at the best of times. I don't think there'd ever been anything like a mission in Tambar Springs. That probably brought just about everyone to hear these city slicker preachers. I wonder what he must have thought about turning up at Tambar Springs. I think he must have thought, gee, this is not much of an opportunity. And yet, his faithfulness changed my dad and our family.